Well, thank you very much for that very generous welcome, and it is a privilege to be with you here this evening. I first came from across the water to preach in Northern Ireland 55 years ago. I sometimes now find myself preaching in a church where the pastor wasn't even born when I started ministry in the province, and on a few occasions in churches where the pastor's parents were not even born. So it's getting a bit serious. I will leave you to attribute which of those applies to our pastor this evening, but he's been a model of communication and preparation for this evening, and I'm very grateful to him for that. It would have been worth coming just to see that window as the sun was straight behind it, shining through it, and made a great impression on me. In fact, I was rather glad to start looking at those words rather than those, because I was getting the impression that there was a halo around my head as the sun was coming through that. And I thought, the sooner I get out of this situation, the better it will be. And so I turned my head, and I'm sorry, the halo disappeared. And so now you really know a little bit more about me. I should say that what we're now going to have, although technically and in an order of church service it would be called a sermon, as you'll soon discover, it's not going to be that, because what your pastor has asked me to speak on is the subject, is God past his sell-by date? I hope you'll be able to stay to the very end of the evening. We should be over by about 11:30, and I hope you'll be able to stay to the rest of it, because after the message, the presentation, and then the break, and we come back here, there's going to be a very interesting interview. The minister said to me beforehand, here are the questions I would like to ask you, and got out a very impressive sheet of paper. And I said, I'd sooner not know what the questions are. When you come back later, you'll know what a mistake that was. But that's what's going to happen. And then right at the very end, I'm going to introduce what I would still consider potentially the most important part of the entire evening. And that is that my good friend Howard Williams, who has been accompanying me on these tours for more years than either of us care to remember, and he is the most important man on the team, because he does all the hard work, prepares the books, gets them here, lays them out, makes all of those practical arrangements, and then will attend to your needs afterwards. And why do I say that's more important, or potentially the most important part of the evening? And it's this. Those of us who are preachers have to face the fact that there are times when 24 hours after hearing us preach, people have forgotten 90% of what we said. And in some cases, that may be exaggerated. It may be even worse than that. But certainly a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month afterwards, if people were to say, what did John Blanchard speak about, you might remember the title, and you'll barely remember anything else. At least that's a possibility. Whereas what is communicated in the printed page, you may have in your house many years hence, and be able, I hope, to benefit from it. So we're going to introduce that. It's the very last thing that will happen in the evening. So I would encourage you, if you're able to stay to the very end of that. I've never known a time in my life, in my Christian life, which goes back 60 plus years, never known a time when the very existence of God has been questioned by so many and denied by not a few. You'll recall a couple of years ago on the London buses, there was a slogan which read, "There is probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." You'll be familiar with the name of, died quite recently, one of the most easily recognized scientists in the world, Stephen Hawking, not to be confused with Richard Dawkins, confined to a wheelchair, speaking with the aid of a voice synthesizer and so forth. He wrote a book called A Brief History of Time. And at one stage he begins to explore what is shortened down to TOE, a theory of everything. Essentially he's asking, what is the theory that glues everything together? The universe and everything, and is there something that holds the whole thing together? And at the end of a very interesting part of the book, he says this: if we could discover that, we would know the mind of God. Now, at that point, we could rightly call Stephen Hawking an agnostic. He wasn't certain about whether God existed or not, But he did say, if we could discover, was there something that glued the whole thing together, then we would know the mind of God. However, some years later, much more recently, he wrote a book called The Grand Design. And he came to the conclusion, believe it or not, with a title like that for a book, there's actually no designer. We don't need God to light the blue touch paper. What an interesting title for a book which concludes there is no designer, and he calls it The Grand Design. Well, our title tonight is a flimsy cover in trying to answer this so important question, one that every intelligent human being should ever ask, and that is, does God exist? Some years ago, a very famous American philosopher, William James, said that the God hypothesis, that is, the idea, the question of whether God exists, and here are his three words, was living, forced, and momentous. Let me tell you what he meant by that. He said, first of all, well, it's a living question. In other words, it's a real possibility. There's no point in just dismissing it and saying, well, it's not even possible, so let's forget about it. It's not like saying, are some circles square? Well, we know that no circle is square, so we needn't even ask the question. So James's first point was, well, it's a living question. Secondly, he said it's a forced question. It's unavoidable. It's either true or false. It cannot be true that God partly exists, or occasionally exists, or exists on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and not on the other days of the week. Here is a forced question. Either God does exist, or he does not. Thirdly, William James said, it's a momentous question. In other words, there are things that follow from it. It's not like the question, does the Loch Ness Monster exist? Now, I've been in that neck of the woods preaching many, many times, and I have to confess to you that I'm always glad I've got my camera with me, just in case I should be the one who discovers Nessie poking his, her, or it head above the waters and making me a lot of money on the side. But suppose that tomorrow's headline is, the Loch Ness Monster has been discovered. There it is, picture of it on the front page of every national newspaper. It's the top story on every news item, which would be a change from Brexit. And there it is, the Loch Ness Monster exists. Now, let me ask you this question. Hear me very carefully. Would that make any difference to your life? Would that affect you in any way? Would your idea, your conception of what life was like be changed? Or what life should be like? Would it change the direction of your life? Would you begin to live in a different kind of way because the Loch Ness Monster's existence had been proved? Would it alter your thoughts about the brevity of life and the certainty of death and what lies beyond it? Now, you know the answer to all of those questions. You know perfectly well that knowing that the Loch Ness Monster exists wouldn't make a hoot of difference to any of those issues. But here is a different question altogether. Does God exist? Because the person who believes in God and the person who does not believe in God don't merely disagree about God, they disagree about the very character of the universe. And there's been no shortage of people all through history who have come out very openly and said, we simply don't believe that God exists. To take a modern one, the author and broadcaster Sir Ludovic Kennedy wrote an article in the Times, a national newspaper, under the heading, Goodbye God, we can get along just fine without you. He was commenting on the decline in the regular weekly attendance in the Church of England. But he added this, why do we bother to keep it, that is the Church of England, why do we bother to keep it alive? Because we know that God is dead. Now, how do you respond to that kind of statement? Well, let me begin my response with two statements of my own. Firstly, it is absolutely impossible for anyone to prove that God does not exist. Now, I've never spoken in this church before, and so I know only that I do have a few friends in the congregation. Other than that, I simply don't know who you are. You may well have come to the service tonight because of the title, and you therefore are among those who would say, well, not even sure that he does. and perhaps he doesn't. And I'm prepared to conduct my life on the basis that he does not exist. Well, listen carefully while I repeat what I said a moment ago. It is absolutely impossible for anyone to prove that God does not exist. I would be happy to debate that with the 5,000, 50,000, 100,000 most intelligent people in the world, and I still believe I could come out on top of that discussion. It is absolutely impossible to prove that God does not exist. It's what we call a universal negative. We simply would not be able to prove it, because unless we knew everything, we couldn't rule out the possibility that among the things we don't know is the fact that God does exist. Secondly, and this may cause a few of you to sit up very abruptly, it's equally impossible to prove that God does exist. I mean, to prove it mathematically or scientifically. Imagine a young woman being found stabbed to death. Her room is a shambles. She's been known to have a relationship with a very violent young man. And on the day that she died, her neighbors saw the young man arriving in his car. Sometime later, they heard a really loud argument going on in the young girl's apartment. And eventually they hear her shout, "Bill, put that knife away. You're hurting me. You're going to kill me." Moments later, they see the young man run away. They see a knife in his hand, and off he goes in his car. They, of course, phone the police. They come in, discover the situation, and eventually they find the young man in his apartment. They look around very carefully. They discover that his clothing is smeared with blood. That's later tested and proved to be the blood of the young lady concerned. They find a knife. The profile of the knife exactly matches the wounds in the girl's body. Now imagine that that is the situation, and you are, well, for simplicity's sake, you are the judge when the case and the charge of murder comes up before you. Now, and you're listening there, or let's bring in a jury then and say that you're one of the members of the jury. You've heard the evidence as I have given it, and you are now asked to decide, is this man guilty or not? Now, I am sure what your verdict would be, even in these very liberal days. I'm sure what your verdict would be, but here's my question. Can you prove it? Were you there? Did you see it happen? Well, the answer to all of those questions is no. You weren't there. You didn't see it happen. Then why would you convict this man of murder when you never saw it happen? To which your answer would be, well, you've only got to look at the evidence. The evidence screams what the truth of the matter is, and that is why you would convict him even though you had never seen him. Now, you've never seen God. So how can you prove that he exists? How can you claim that he does? Well, in the absence of seeing him, of being there, of seeing him literally and physically at work, your response to that would be, well, where does the evidence point? And that's really the way in which I want to approach our subject tonight. And I want us to look at three pieces of evidence, just three, and I've chosen them for this reason, that everybody agrees that this evidence, these pieces of evidence, is powerful and meaningful. And I mean, everybody does. Here is an atheist who says there is no God. Here is an agnostic who says, well, I'm not sure, there may or may not be. Here is a skeptic who says, well, I've got all kinds of doubts about whether God exists. And here, on the other hand, is a committed Christian who says, yes, I know that God exists. So they have very different views, very different convictions, but they are all agreed, and you'll hear that in a moment, they are all agreed that these pieces of evidence are powerful. Just three of them, and all of them related to what we are as human beings. Speaking on Radio 5 some time ago, Richard Dawkins, one of the best-known atheists in the world, said this: there is precisely no evidence for the existence of God. Now, is that really true? On the one hand, the theist, the Christian, if you will, is absolutely convinced. He says there's so much evidence, I wouldn't know where to begin. Well, again, I want to focus on three on which everybody shakes hands. The atheist, the agnostic, the skeptic, and the Christian, they're all agreed. They're not having a fight about it, no element of disagreement about it. These three pieces of evidence, they all agree, are powerful pieces of evidence. And the first is this: human dignity. Now, although they come at it from a very different angle, the atheists, the agnostics, the skeptics, and the Christians are all agreed that human beings have greater dignity than any other being on our planet. Even the second humanist manifesto, which was much more directly atheistic than the first one, speaks of, and I quote, the preciousness and dignity of the individual. I was standing a few days ago on Ground Zero at the World Trade Center in New York on the 17th anniversary of 9/11, and it was a deeply moving experience. A few days after 9/11, the American actor James Earl Jones said this: "We reaffirm our faith in the dignity of every individual." In 1996, George Alagaya reported on a civil war in Sierra Leone and the dreadful atrocities that took place there. In one particular case, soldiers came across a pregnant woman, and they took bets as to whether the fetus was male or female. So they laid their bets, they got hold of the woman, they killed her, slit her open, determined the gender of the fetus, and settled their bets. When I heard the story told by George Alagaya, I nearly vomited in my lounge. And even now, sometime later, in telling the story, something revolts within me. But why should that be the case? If the atheist is right in saying there is no God, and we're here as what we call human beings, simply as the result of a long process, millions of years of process of unguided evolution from nothing to something and from something to us, and that's all there is to it. If that is true, what is the difference between taking an orange off a tree, laying some bets as to how many pips there are in the orange, slitting open the orange, counting the pips, and settling the bets? What's the difference? How did the orange get there? Well, the atheist would say it was not created in any way. It just arose over a process of development and of what we can call evolution over millions of years. How did human beings get here? Listen, by exactly the same process. So what is the difference between killing a pregnant woman and deciding the gender of the fetus in her womb and cutting down an orange from a tree and determining how many seeds it contained? You see, the atheist says that man began as an accident, it's going to end in annihilation, and then in between that, between the accident and the annihilation, he is of immense significance. Some years ago now, some atheists made a noise about wanting to appear on the BBC radio program that's held every morning and has been for many years, called Thought for the Day. And the national media got hold of the story, and I wrote a letter to the Daily Telegraph, and I said this: I would be very interested to hear what the atheists have to say on Thought for the Day. I think it would be fascinating to read it, because I can't imagine what they would say any morning I heard it that would bring a spring to my step and a glow to my cheeks and a sparkle to my eye as I looked forward to that particular work. Now, I said why I would be so fascinated, because I'm just not clear what their message is that would help me so much. After all, I went on to say, the atheist says that we began as a fluke, we live as a farce, and we end as fertilizer. And the letter's editor of the Telegraph phoned me up and said, "Do you really mean to say that?" And I said, "That's exactly what I mean to say, because that is the atheist's creed. We began as a fluke. We weren't created. That's what happened." There was what Charles Darwin once speculated was a warm little pond with some chemicals floating around in it, and somehow or other those chemicals acquired what we call life, though there's never yet been an explanation of what life is. That life got more and more complex, and eventually we find ourselves here as human beings. But we began as a fluke, and we live as a farce. What is the point of life? At the very end of our meeting together, I want to introduce you to the most detailed book I've ever written on that, and for this tour, the publishers have made it possible for us to offer you that book at half price, so don't run away before the end of the evening or you'll miss that opportunity. But it answers the question, well, what's the meaning of life? And if you are not a committed Christian tonight, I'd really like to ask you that question. What do you think is the meaning of life? And where did that meaning come from? What's its significance? So the atheist doesn't have an answer to that question, so we live as a farce. And of course, we end as fertilizer. We're just dumped in the ground one way or the other. I scattered, or helped to scatter, to bury the ashes of a member of my extended family just a few weeks ago. And that, the atheist says, is where it all ends. So we begin as a fluke, we live as a farce, and we end as fertilizer. Think of Peter Atkins, who lectured in physical chemistry at Oxford University. He says, and I quote him word for word, humanity is, quote, just a bit of slime on a planet. Now, if that's the case, and he's an outspoken atheist, if that is the case, what is the point? What is the meaning of life? Why do we speak of living with dignity? Why do we speak of treating people with dignity? Why do we speak of the importance of dying with dignity? If man has no meaning to life, if the survival of life is a mark of progress, why should we care for the senile, the chronically sick, the starving, the educationally subnormal? Surely it would be better, easier, quicker, save a lot of money for the NHS and we ourselves if as soon as a person reaches that stage, forgive me being crude about it, we bump them off and get on with life. If we have no dignity, then that's open to us to do, surely. Why is there so much talk about human rights? If we began as an accident, live as a farce, and end as fertilizer, what rights do we have? But today, our culture is filled with statements about our rights. Women's rights, gay rights, employers' rights, employees' rights, civil rights, the rights of the poor, the disabled, the homeless, and even the unborn. Why do we do that if we are merely accidents and flukes? So, although all the people we've put up here on the platform psychologically with me, the atheist, the skeptic, the agnostic, the skeptic, and the Christian, all agree that human dignity is an important piece of evidence. But they come to a very different conclusion as to why that is the case. The atheist, if we ask him, well, where do we get human dignity from? And so he would have to say, well, I don't know, but we certainly do have it. The agnostic would say, well, I don't know, because that's the answer agnostics give. They say, I don't know. That defines the agnostic. He's a don't-knower. We ask the skeptic, and we get much the same kind of question. But if you ask the Christian, do you think we have that there's a dignity about human life? He would say, yes, there is. If we ask the Christian, then why do we have that dignity? He would read these words from Scripture. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And he would say, and rightly say, that is where we get our dignity. That's what sets human beings apart and above all other life forms. The person who believes in God has a coherent explanation for believing that he has more value than a virus. Or the atheist agrees with the conclusion, but he has no answer and no reason to give as to why it is so. Secondly, human morality. This is something that sets human beings apart from every other living being on our planet. When an animal kills or steals, no crime is committed. No law is broken. There's no evidence that it feels guilty or ashamed. But it's not the same for us. Every one of us, without exception, operates within some kind of ethical framework. It differs in detail from society to society, from person to person. Nevertheless, it is there. There's a radical difference, we believe, between right and wrong. Imagine a lawyer defending someone in a very serious case, and as it comes towards an end, and the lawyer makes his final statement and summing up, he says, "Sir, my client is not denying that he did what he is charged with doing." No point in listening to any evidence. He simply agrees that this is what he did. But he has no sense of right or wrong. He doesn't believe there's a difference between them. So what I'm asking you to do is either to dismiss the case altogether or to pass a sentence that is so light, so trivial, so almost irrelevant, it would appear, but it ties in with the fact that this man has no sense of a radical difference between right and wrong. Well, I don't think he'd get very far with that appeal. Simply put, human beings have consciences. Consciences are not the same as an instinct or desire. We sometimes have an instinct to do something, but we shouldn't do it. Or we have a desire to do something, and we shouldn't do it. But the conscience operates at a deeper and higher level altogether. It's a mysterious moral monitor that each one of us has, and that governs our life to a powerful degree. It distinguishes between good and bad, right and wrong, fair and unfair, just and unjust, and tells us that we have obligations and responsibilities. I'll never forget reading, a number of years ago now, in the Daily Telegraph, the journalist Janet Daly, who made no pretensions about being a believer, and she was writing on the situation that then obtained in Afghanistan, not the present one, but nevertheless a very serious one. And she said this, and I quote, listen carefully, "There is an absolute moral duty to alleviate poverty and starvation." Now, I guess we would all agree with that, but I've got some questions. Why is it a duty? Why do we have a duty to help other people? Why is it a moral duty? Why is it an absolute moral duty? Where do we get those ideas from, unless there is an answer to who we are and why we are here? Now, there are four possibilities as to why we have that sense of oughtness that the conscience brings to us. The first is, it comes from something beneath ourselves. It comes from nature. But we can immediately reject that because nature is amoral. It doesn't have a moral dimension. There's no way in which it can define ethics. It's impossible to jump from atoms to ethics and molecules to morality. If we are nothing more than shrink-wrapped bags of biological elements governed by the laws of physics, we have no moral obligations. Secondly, it comes from within ourselves as individuals. We can pick and choose our morals, the way we might choose food from a buffet counter, and there's no right of anybody to say that we are wrong. That is technically called relativism. Things may be relatively this way or that, but it's up to us. We choose what we think is right, and nobody has the right to say we are wrong. Let me give you some examples of where that would get us. The famous American author Ernest Hemingway said this, quote, "What is moral is what you feel good after. What is immoral is what you feel bad after," unquote. And my friends, there are millions of people out there who would say that is exactly the fact. But how does that sit alongside gang rape or child abuse or burglars torturing an 80-year-old widow? How does that sit alongside the idea of an old lady walking along the street And she's set upon by 2 or 3 young men who steal her handbag or purse, discover some money in it, go to their drug dealer, and get a big fix of drugs. Listen to Hemingway. What is moral is what you feel good after. What is immoral is what you feel bad after. Those young men would have felt good when they found an unprotected old lady. They would have felt better when they discovered money in her purse. They would have felt better when they took that to their drug dealer. And they would feel even better when they gave themselves a massive fix of drugs. What did Hemingway say? What is moral is what you feel good after. Does that mean that what they would do was moral? Hugh Hefner, the founder of the infamous Playboy empire, claimed to have slept with over 1,000 women. Yet he told the Daily Telegraph, and I quote exactly, "I'm a very ethical guy. Moderation is the key," unquote. What you feel, what is good and moral is what you feel good after. Adolf Hitler thought it right to kill 6 million Jews. If everyone was entitled to choose his or her own morality, we have no right to say that he is wrong. It's chilling even to utter that sentence. If we are free to choose our own morality and nobody has the right to say that we're wrong, we have no right to say that he was wrong in what he did in the notorious Holocaust. So that gets us nowhere. Thirdly, something equal to ourselves, the society, the prevailing culture. Now, there are 3 problems about that, but there are many more. Why is public opinion any better than personal opinion? Does quantity automatically produce quality? Secondly, cultures change, laws change from one era to another, from one decade to another. A government may pass a law that says such and such is wrong, but 10 years later, the same government may decide that it's right after all. And 20 years later, the same government or their successors would now say, no, it is wrong after all. So those changes mean that we can't just look at culture, what is going on in our day and age, and say that makes it right or wrong. And then what do we do when cultures disagree? I love the story of a man who on his way to work every day passed a watchmaker's shop and was seen when he got there to look at a lovely, huge clock face in the window, clearly adjust his watch, and then go on to work. The owner of the shop saw him do this day after day, 5 days a week, and finally his curiosity got the better of him, so he stood there and interrupted the man and said, look, excuse me interrupting, but I noticed that every day you come along and you look at that wonderful clock face, and then I would imagine you adjust your watch. What do you do for a living? He says, well, I am the timekeeper in the factory just down the road. And so I give a signal or a sound when it's time for a coffee break or for lunch and so forth. And especially at the end of the day, I sound a very loud hooter at 5 o'clock on the dot so that people know when it's time to go home. The trouble is, my watch doesn't keep very good time. And so as I walk to work every day, I look at that clock and I correct it according to the clock. The shopkeeper said, well, that's great. I'm interested to hear that, but I have some bad news for you. That clock doesn't keep very good time. So when cultures disagree, the culture in this land is not the same as the one in Venezuela or China or North Korea or whatever. Which one is right, which one is wrong, and how do we decide which is which? Now, as it doesn't come from beneath us, from nature, doesn't come from within us, not from ourselves, doesn't come from around us, from the culture, there is only one other possible source for this mysterious moral monitor that we call the conscience. And that source, well, these things would need to be true about that source. It would need to be transcendent. Let me just explain what the word transcendent means. It's one of my very favorite words in the English language. It might be the favorite word that I have in the English language. Well, it's either that or crème brûlée. But as crème brûlée is French and 2 words, transcendent comes out on top. It means something over and above and beyond us to which we contribute nothing. So this source, this basis for a conscience deciding between right and wrong would need to be transcendent. Secondly, it would need to be absolutely perfect. Thirdly, it would need to be unchangeable. And fourthly, it would need to be personal, because moral obligations involve people. We don't have any moral obligation toward the law of gravity. We better obey it, but we don't have a moral obligation towards it. So we're looking for a source, a basis for our morality that is these four things: transcendent, perfect, unchanging, and personal. And as we open our Bibles, we find a God of whom all these things are true. The law of the Lord is perfect, the Bible tells us. So the idea of personal accountability is built into the fabric of human life, and our creation by God explains why He is the source of our moral sense. And then thirdly, human rationality. We all agree that we are correctly described as Homo sapiens, a thinking people. We think and reason. Some atheists go even further and say they're the only ones whose thinking is straight. At the turn of the millennium, I wrote a book called Why Y2K. A Christian friend of mine sent a copy to a brother of his who lived in Australia, in the hope that he would read it and see that he got his thinking wrong. His brother replied and included in his letter this message: anything John Blanchard says is a load of total garbage, piffle, poppycock, and unmitigated balderdash. Now that's a lot of big words for an Australian, but that's what he said. In The Independent in 1996, Richard Dawkins said this: "Have you ever met an uneducated atheist?" Unquote. What a... No, I won't. But what a statement to make. Have you ever met an uneducated atheist? What Dawkins is saying is, look, if you meet a person who is genuinely an atheist, he is an educated person. May not have gone to university, may not have a PhD degree, but he is an educated person if he believes there is no God. Elsewhere he wrote this: "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane." Oh, and he did add that what he was bothered about by creationists was that they were so intolerant. But we'll pass that by for the time being. But Dawkins is committing logical suicide here. He claims that ruling God out of existence, specifically in matters of creation, is an indication of intelligent, rational thinking. And yet, elsewhere he says this, that we came into existence, listen to his words, by a blind, automatic process, unquote, that had no purpose in mind. In other words, our brains that we use to come to rational conclusions were not created for the purpose of coming to rational conclusions. A few years ago now, I was in a McDonald's in the United States, a very small shop as it happens, and I was there with a newspaper at hand, and I saw a weird-looking person walking around the McDonald's. Now, why I call him a weird-looking person may sound a bit rude, and I only say that he was a rude-looking person, crude-looking person, is because that's what he was. And he had his coffee mug in his hand, and he was walking around, and I thought, oh, mercy, I hope he doesn't see me. So my newspaper suddenly became a big screen up like this. I thought, well, that'll keep him out. You know exactly what happens next. He came up to me and said, "Excuse me, I didn't want to interrupt you." And I thought, well, we'd agreed on that. So far, we're on the same page. And then he leant across and said, "I want to ask you a question." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Where did thought come from?" And then he made as if to walk away, and before he went, he said, "Now that makes you think, doesn't it?" And off he went. And that was the end of this philosophical discussion. But what a great question to ask. So, my friend, if you're here tonight and you're not a committed Christian, you may say you're not even an agnostic. You are, in fact, an atheist, and the only reason you're in here in a church on Sunday night is because of the subject, is God past his sell-by date? Now, if you're in that position, let me ask you the question that this guy asked me. Where did thought come from? If you're basing your life, your lifestyle, your thoughts about life and death, if you're basing them on something that your brain has produced, you've done some thinking, where did thought come from? If Charles Darwin was right in talking about this warm little pond and these chemicals floating around, somehow requiring something called life, that life getting more and more complex and eventually arriving where we are today. Yes, but where did thought come from? And it simply defies a logical answer. If our brains are accidental, why should we trust them? If our brains were not created for the purpose of coming to logical conclusions, why do we trust that it does? C.S. Lewis, always worth quoting in this part of the world, said this: if I can't trust my own thinking, I can't trust the argument leading to atheism, and therefore I have no reason to be an atheist, unquote. As usual, what a brilliant statement by C.S. Lewis. Now, the theist, the person who believes in God, is in a very different situation. Listen to what he reads in Scripture. Oh, the depths of the riches, the wisdom, and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God that God should repay him? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Is God past his sell-by date? No, he is not. Because without God, we have no explanation of the fact that we believe deeply and seriously that we have human dignity. We all believe, every one of us, regardless of who you are tonight, you agree that we have human morality. We may disagree one from another as to whether that particular thing lies on this side or that of the point of truth. And we're all agreed that we have human rationality, that we are thinking people who say we can come to logical and proper conclusions. None of those things would be true if God was past his sell-by date, and so we can be sure that he is not. Let's bow our heads in prayer together, and then Norman will come and lead us forward for the rest of our time together. Heavenly Father, what we know not, teach us. What we have not, give us. And what we are not, make us. We pray in the name of your Son, our Savior. Amen.